Hey everybody, it's Mrs. Peachy from Summer School Biology. Today we're going to talk a little bit about population as it applies to biology and the different types of organisms and how they grow, how their populations can grow, and what can affect that population growth. So let's start with what population growth is, and that's any change in a population's number. And you might think, since I have in parentheses up or down, that it doesn't make sense that growth can be down. In this case, it would be considered negative population growth if the population was in fact shrinking. So we're looking at what are the main types of growth. We could have a steady rate of population growth, or we can have exponential growth. And exponential growth is, where the population keeps increasing by a certain factor over time. And that can be very taxing, very difficult for an environment to support. All right, so some types of organisms reproduce very quickly, and so they have fast growing populations. So these would be organisms that are typically smaller. Typically during reproduction, there's lots of them that are reproduced. They have short lifespans. Not many of them survive. Tons of offspring with little to no parental care. Very early sexual maturity, so the reproduction takes place constantly throughout a population. And the environment itself is unstable. Maybe there's lots of predators, or there is, in a harsh type of environment, so that they need to make sure that there are a lot of offspring in order to ensure the carry-on of the genes. So you can see the examples here, and I don't think that's probably any surprise to you all. This usually forms a J-shaped exponential curve, and that happens pretty quickly. And in the case of some organisms, such as bacteria, for example, you can see exponential population growth take place within a matter of a day. And others are more on the order of days to weeks to months to a few years. We also have slow-growing populations, and these would be animals that have larger body sizes and longer lifespans. They tend to reproduce less frequently. Maybe they just reproduce once a year or twice a year even. They have fewer numbers of offspring. They tend to be more tied to their offspring, and the offspring are more dependent upon the parents for survival, and they don't reach sexual maturity very early. And they usually, this is very important, live within the carrying capacity of the environment, except for humans. So that's kind of get into that conversation a little bit here. But for the most part, the natural predator-prey relationships that exist, as well as the inherent struggle to survive, the limit of resources, makes that population have a certain type of cap as far as how big that population can get. Now, we have humans listed here because we are this type of offspring, but we'll talk about what the carrying capacity means and how we are approaching that. Most mammals are going to fit into this, birds, some fish. Okay, we're going to go to some of those in just a second, but let me look here at carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is the number of organisms an environment can support for an indefinite period of time. So it is determined by the environment itself. So as the environment changes, the carrying capacity can change. So, for example, or even as technology changes, the carrying capacity can change. For example, with the development of agriculture, modern agriculture, the carrying capacity of the earth changed because there was a greater availability of food, that resource. So that would increase the carrying capacity. And as the resources become limited, then the carrying capacity could decrease. So that's not a finite number. It's something that is determined by the environment in which an organism lives. And if there are, climate changes and stuff, that can have an effect on that carrying capacity. So these things that determine what the carrying capacity is of an environment are called limiting factors. And the ones that are probably the most directly related to the population are the density dependent factors. So these are the things that that as population grows, they become a greater effect, right? So sharing resources, food, water, could be with plants, you're talking about nutrients and sunlight and stuff like that. Shelter, a lot of those resources that we need to survive, if there's not an availability of them, then that is going to reduce the number of organisms that can survive in that environment. These are also things such as kind of direct effects of having too large of a population, such as the spread of disease, right? So as population grows, disease becomes more likely to be able to be spread because you're just closer in physical space, and so that can actually lead to a maximum population within a particular environment, because if it gets too big, then the disease will take over and kind of wipe out a lot of the population. Parasites, which is kind of like disease anyways. Limited space. Think about in terms of plants and how they grow, and they are competing for that space. They don't just pick up and move, so it is a competition to see how many organisms can survive in a given space. Predation. If you have natural predators, then the predators will limit how many prey there will be, because if there's too many, the predators will be able to have more food, so the number of predators will go up, and therefore that will reduce the number of prey. And another thing, when you get too many organisms in a given space, since there is competition, there's going to be aggression and violence and stuff like that. So these are all directly dependent upon the size of the population. We also have density independent factors. These are things that just will, wipe out part of the population, and it really has nothing to do with the size of the population, but it dramatically reduces the size. So primarily natural disasters in this case. You can also look at, when it comes to organisms outside of humans, some of the things that people do to destroy habitats. Okie doke. I want to show you a couple of video clips, so I'm going to take a quick pause here. Okay, I'm going to show you a clip here just so you can see how quickly population has grown. And what I want you to notice about this is that when we start off, here we are at 178 AD, and you can kind of see that population is really relegated to Europe, to India. We have some in Southeast Asia, China more than likely here. And these are going to be just our main population centers. But I want you to notice how the growth rate changes as time moves on. So not necessarily the number of people, but how quickly that number changes as time moves on. Okay, let's go. Okay, so we're almost at 400 AD. Still kind of relegated to the same areas. 8 pop-ups. 900, almost 1000 AD. Oh, Europe is booming. $1700s, 1800s, up to 1970, and wow, look at that. it just takes off. Okay, so we definitely have a major increase in the size of the population as time increased. Not just the size, but the growth rate itself. So as you can see here, that is what we call a exponential growth rate, excuse me. So when we finally get to the point where we reach that carrying capacity. So remember that carrying capacity is the number of organisms that an environment can support. And as I said to you before, that number can change. So just give me, so I'm going to show you a graph here in just a sec. Okay, so you can kind of see this graph is showing you not the J-shaped curve necessarily, but it's actually what we call an S-shaped curve. So instead of the, the typical J shape that you see with exponential growth, it's flat up here, get that curve, and it's flat down here, right? So it curves up real fast, and then it flattens out. So that's what we call an S-shaped curve, and this is something called a logistical growth. So it starts off here as exponential, right after the lag phase, but once that carrying capacity is reached, the population steadies. And you do have periods where it goes, up and down in response to, an increase in resources, and then you get an increase in population, which then means there's fewer resources available, so you get a decrease in population, which then means now there's an excess of resources, so we have an increase in population, so it kind of, cycles that way. But otherwise, it pretty much has a very straight, linear growth. In other words, no growth at all after that carrying capacity is reached. Now, you may have some sort of density independent factor that comes in and drops that population way back down again, but as long as the density dependent factors don't change, then that carrying capacity remains constant. So again, this is logistical growth. The first part here, this classic J shape, is called exponential growth. And to kind of give you an example of exponential growth, kind of what we mean mathematically by that, let's go ahead and let's see what I can do here. Okay. I'm going to try to do a little bit of writing on the board. Okay, so let's say we start off with, we just start off with a 2 of something, right? Over time, that's going to double. So what we have then is we're going to have 4. And over the same length of time, that's going to double again to 8, right? We can kind of predict here, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512. Okay, so you kind of get the idea here is we keep doubling it in the same period of time. Whether that period of time is an hour or whether the population doubles, every 10 years, the fact of the matter is that population just keeps doubling until those numbers get to be very, very large. We double 512, we get 1,024, right? We double 1,024, we get 2,048. So we're just going to keep increasing it exponentially. It's increasing much faster than the number of periods, and that's what exponential growth really is. So that's our normal exponential growth. We see that in populations like bacteria and other very short-living populations, but those that are like us, that are longer living, typically have this logistical growth. All right, so that's the population for biology that we're going to look at right now anyways in a nutshell. And if you have any questions, as usual, you know where to find me.